Okay, Chair, we're live.
Okay, thank you. Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's meeting of the Flood Recovery and Resilience Board. And thank you, everyone who's in attendance. So, Sophie, just for the record, can you advise on apologies and substitutes, please?
Yes, Chair, we've received apologies from Toby Sang and Richard Hellings from Network Rail.
Thank you. Not aware of any more or any substitutes. Item 2, perhaps can remind members to declare any interest they may have in items on the agenda as they arise. Item 3, there are no confidential items, so no need to exclude press and public. Item 4 is the minutes of the meeting held on the 30th of September. People who are happy that they're a correct record, or are there any corrections or comments on them? Okay, I'm seeing content to agree those. Thank you. So item 4, flood events of 9th of February 2020 and 20th of February 2022. Adrian, are you introducing? I assume you're introducing these items.
That's correct, Councillor. I'll be, I guess, giving a quick overview of the 2 reports that we're presenting today, and then answering questions as best I can. Unfortunately, Mohammed can't be with us today, so it may be the really detailed questions. I need to take those away. But as the board will be aware, there have been sort of 2 outstanding Section 19 reports that the council have been coordinating in relation to the events on the 9th of Feb 2020 and 20th of Feb 2022. Certainly, I'll talk through each of the events separately, but certainly the event back in 2020 was particularly significant, and perhaps something we'll touch on is how we, I guess, captured during the event, perhaps the impact that was taking place. So taking each event in order then, if we cast our minds back now to the 9th of February 2020, or perhaps the run up to the 9th of February, should I say, we saw quite extensive rainfall from the end of January to the 8th of Feb, with between 90 and 140 millimetres of rain falling in that period. What we saw during the event itself was quite heavy rainfall, with return period of 150 of a rainfall return period, sorry, of 150 to 1 in 200 year event up at Gorpley, and that translates to about 70 to 113 millimetres in 24-hour period at Gorpley. So quite a lot of rain falling on already very wet ground. As always with the Calder Valley, we saw a relatively fast response in the rivers, and we saw sort of river level events in the order of 1 in 40 to 1 in 65. Now that may not seem particularly rare, but actually in terms of river levels, it's probably the second most significant river event for the Calder Valley. And certainly in terms of impact, that was also the case. The report highlights that nearly 4,000 residential and business properties were impacted by that event, with internal flooding to over 1,200. The rough split being 700 residential and 600 businesses, just under 600 businesses. We saw impacts right down the Calder Valley, from Walsden, Todd, Hebden Bridge, Martham, Roy, Ludford, all the way down to Halifax, Elland and Brighouse. But probably 50% of the properties identified as being affected were in Hebden Bridge and Brighouse. Something we've made quite a big, highlighted certainly in conversations with other organisations since that event, is that we believe the flooding that took place nationally, over 37% of the properties affected were in Calderdale. But I've been doing a little bit of work with Joe at the Environment Agency, and unfortunately that wasn't captured during the event. So there is some more work that we need to do to understand how we better capture the impact of some of these big events during an event. Now, that's largely due to the fact we need to confirm that flooding has taken place. But I think one of the issues in this event was, one, the nature of the Calderdale, the flooding happens very quickly and goes away. And two, we were expecting further flooding as a result of another named storm moving in the following week. I think the thing for Calderdale to be aware of, though, is that the local narrative is that nearly 4,000 properties were affected, but that may not be the national narrative if that wasn't what was captured through the reporting at the time. So I think there is further work for us to do, working with the Environment Agency to look at perhaps how we can better benchmark or correlate river levels to potential impact, and use that as an evidence-based during an event for reporting purposes to be confirmed as soon as possible after the event. The detail of the report is included in the pack, but generally the report finds that our preparation and response to the event was collectively very good, although there were some small issues around forecasting, staffing levels, and comms during the event. And again, there's lessons being learned on the back of that. We'll then briefly move on to the event of the 20th of February 2022 before taking questions. This was a result of Storm Franklin, which was the third named storm to hit the UK within a week. It was predominantly a rainfall event, with rain falling over the period of 15th to 21st of February being approximately 150 to 190% of the long-term average for February. So again, a lot of rainfall falling over that period. The rainfall event itself was not particularly rare. So when you look at the 18 to 24 hour period, it's about a 1 in 30 year rainfall event. And the river levels were also not particularly rare, 1 in 2 to 1 in 30, depending on the location. In terms of the impacts that we saw then, we saw impacts to approximately 22 residential properties and 3 businesses. And this was primarily a result of surface water, mainly linked located along highways, where we saw a lot of blocking of highway drains. And we believe that is largely due to kind of leaf and debris falling as a result of the strong winds in preceding events, and actually in the hours prior to the rainfall event itself. So again, the report concludes that actually our response to that event was very good. There are, again, as always, some minor lessons to be learned around preparation, incident management and recovery, with perhaps some further work to be done looking at the resilience of the drainage infrastructure. But I must admit, it's that might be quite a difficult issue to resolve, given the time of year and the fact that this isn't a long-running maintenance issue. We believe this was, as I say, leaf fall and debris as a result of the strong winds in the days and hours preceding the event. So apologies if that was either too detailed, too mumbled, or too brief. But I'm happy to take questions as best I can.
No, I think that felt like about the right length. Obviously, we then got the summary report and the detailed report. So between the two, there's a good level of detail for people to dip into. Thank you, Adrian. Jane, Councillor Scullion.
Thank you, Chair. I must declare an interest as somebody who's affected by flooding in the upper Calder Valley and was affected by both of those events. Quite upsetting in some ways to read some of the description, but having declared that interest, I think bringing my personal experience to bear as a background to my comments, I think is helpful. And I want to start with a sort of apology to the officers. I have chased for these wretched Section 19 reports. And now when you actually see them and you see the level of technical detail in them, you do realise actually how much careful, considered, technical and scientifically evidence-based work goes into them. And we need that. We need that for the future. I think one of the things that really struck me reading in detail was virtually, particularly in terms of the surface water event, but both of them, how pretty much every river in our catchment area was affected, and pretty much every part of the borough in terms of surface water. The people who live on the tops are not exempt to the heavy rainfall created by climate change. So it's a whole Calderdale problem. I wanted to say something about some of the just details picked up within the reports, and then just make a general point, Chair, if I may. In terms of the detail bits, the question of the gauges, I think, is one I would like to pick up for further discussion with the Environment Agency and others, because, for example, there was a mention of a gauge in Brighouse, where the readings were so unreliable that actually they were reading negative, during an event, and we just cannot have that. We need to actually have, in terms of our assets, in this case, we need to, where gauges have gone, where they're unreliable, and so we need to have a proper asset register of those and update, etc. It's not good enough to basically leave them until the next event. I think the question of communications continues to be one you can see from these reports that exercises us as a borough. And I was interested in terms of, there was a little smacking of the wrists for wardens using WhatsApp rather than the comms they had been provided. Actually, in terms of on the ground during an event, there has to be a degree of autonomy for people on the ground dealing with things, and what works is what works, really. And we depend a lot on our flood wardens and our council officers, and we trust them, and they need to be given the tools for the job that they've got to do. I wanted to pick up on the overall catchment issues, because we do have a lot of reservoirs around us, and I know that the conversation is moving on in some ways around drought, etc. But I think we'd still need to have those robust conversations about future planning, not just planning for the short term. What if we get an event next February, but the planning for the next 10, 20, 30, 50 years, really. And we need to be, as a council, at the table for some of those robust national conversations about reservoirs in our catchment. I think the question about data, which Adrian focused on, absolutely, and it came up at the Yorkshire Flood and Resilience Committee yesterday, about that we are actually underreporting across Yorkshire the economic effect of the damage created by these events. And for example, I saw within the report, I can't find the figure now, I saw within the report a figure for the damage caused by the flooding to the railway at Wolsden. Now, it was a small amount, and it was the direct cost of repairing that damage. If you think about the economic cost of actually having the railway, our main arterial heavy rail route through the borough out, it is a major and repeated damage to our local economy. So the way in which we use data and the way in which we report the impact of flooding, I think, is important. Those were the kind of detailed points I wanted to raise, Chair, but there was one more thing I wanted to just to think about as a committee, the council members and the partners, is to a degree, we have lost our competitive edge in relation to flooding, I would argue, in that we've had flooding and people go, oh yeah, Calderdale floods again, and so on, and they're always complaining and they're always moaning about flooding. And of course, other areas have in different ways been experiencing similar events, different but similar. And I wonder if perhaps we should think as a borough, as a council, about actually moving on to talking about not so much flooding, but about water management, that we're a leading borough in terms of water management in relation to, and whether that's drought or whether that's flooding, it is all about water management, really. So the general point in terms of reading these Section 19 reports about emergencies, yes, there are lots of things to do and lots of things to learn. But I think there's a wider point about our learning as a borough from the experiences that we've had and shaped us, and how we move on to the future. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks very much, Jane. I'll only bring officers in if I sort of see an immediate bit of query that needs answering, if that's okay, Adrian, and so look to bring in the 3 councillors have indicated, and then perhaps check also whether from the Environment Agency or Yorkshire Water perspective there's anything people want to add. So Scott, Councillor Patient.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, a few things. I mean, I'll first of all, I'll make a similar interest as someone that's been affected by flooding various locations and kids' school has, etc. Also, vice chair of flood warden group in Mythen Road, and I know we've got the chair of that group here as well with us. I think there's a few things, and I mean, I slightly agree with much of what Councillor Scullion said. I think the water management thing is good, but I think what it perhaps does is moves the dial a bit too far away from what flooding is and the discussion around climate change and what that means for us more broadly. So I think that needs a bit more of a finer managed hand, because I wouldn't want to move that dial away from us being seen as somewhere that has to respond to emergencies from time to time. And water management is part of that, I agree, but maybe a broader discussion about how we do that. I think there's a few things that I want to just pick up on. One is resource going forward and us being effectively able to continue to respond to that. And some of that is internal as a council, because I know we have some resource issues within the flood team, although we are incredibly resourced versus other locations. When you hear other boroughs have 1 or 2 officers focused on flooding, we've got a reasonably resourced team, but I think we need to do a bit of a deep dive into making sure that's effective going forward, because thinking back about the 2020 event, let's not forget we were only a month away from a potential disaster, and that occurring as lockdown had happened to us, and I think that would have been an entirely different story. I think we forget that. I actually really think we forget how disastrous that would have been, managing social distancing, managing vulnerabilities, and at the same time responding to a flood event. We were very, very lucky. It's worth repeating. And if something similar were to happen again, we need to make sure that we're in the right place to respond. I guess the second piece is about what technical solutions can we have to manage some of this adaptation and resilience. I'm thinking about part of this was about some of our drains being impacted by leaves and debris and stuff. And I mean, yeah, I'm no engineering officer, but a cursory look about some solutions in other locations is, mesh covers for some of our drains that can be, raised easily, but actually don't allow particular drains not to be impacted so much. So I wonder if there are any tech solutions that are, relatively low cost that we might think about rolling out in some of our more flood prone locations. Again, really want to pay testament to, like Jane, I've been waiting for these reports, and you can see that they're actually mammoth Dostoevsky style reads. So I appreciate the incredible amount of work that's gone into putting them together. It feels like the partnership response is there and still exists quite strongly. But I mean, again, I did declare an interest, but just want to make sure that wardens on the ground and other community responders are given the flexibility in terms of flood events to respond in the way that they do. I think the conversation about what flood wardens do versus what your own personal resilience is has moved on much in the past few years. We're not getting people coming banging on our door for flood sacks and sandbags anymore. I think actually the work that we've put into Eye on Calderdale and our comms as community groups versus comms as a council has been effective. And I think when you repeat something long enough, it starts to sink in. So it's been shown that we've done that, and we've got a really good resource into our comms in Janine and Lauren as well, and long may that last. I guess it's just in terms of tidying it up. How do we do that? How do we make it last longer? And I think part of that is making sure that we have the resource within our team to make sure those partnerships and responses to future events are real. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Scott. Councillor Holsworth. Councillor Holsworth just disappeared for a moment. Okay, I'll go to Councillor Lee and then come back to Councillor Holdsworth.
Thank you, Chair. I've got several points too. I agree with a number of the things that Councillor Scullion mentioned. I think we've been having debates about, I've been having debates while I've been on this council for about the last 5 years or so about this. And so that we appear to have these incidents, and things that we said would be desirable tend not to be done for a variety of reasons. And so, I feel there's a sense of repetition about these meetings. So the first thing I'd like to mention is I do strongly believe that the controlling reservoir levels is would be a very useful thing to do if done properly. And one has to examine why that is proving to be a difficult nut to crack. And I think one of the problems is that the Yorkshire Water Authority has to keep reservoirs at a very high level because the pipeline system leaks like a colander. And so the danger for Yorkshire Water is if there's a reduction in the level of the reservoir in case of a flooding event, and it doesn't happen, then they could quickly exhaust the reservoir's capacity because it's leaking, all the water's leaking. So that's a complex problem because of investment in pipelines, I would say, by not just Yorkshire Water, but throughout the country. The loss of water through leaks from pipelines is huge. So that doesn't help us get our reservoir levels lowered, and it would be good if we could. And then Adrian mentioned drainage infrastructure, and we've spoken on many occasions about the lack or the decline in the management of our moorlands, our upper levels. They used to be well maintained with clearly defined culverts and ditches and mechanisms for retaining water on the top of the hill rather than it just flash flooding right off it again. And I don't hear that a lot of work's been done on that to retain water on the tops of our hills. And I do have a question finally on this, at the lower levels. Adrian, you mentioned leaves and things like that being a problem with surface water at low levels. And I think that that's a convenient thing for people, not you, I'm not saying you're saying this, for people to argue that the main cause is debris because it's a windy time and all that, and the leaves have done it. And again, I think there's a more fundamental problem than a superficial idea that it's leaves, because I know specific instances in my ward where a lot of the damage, a lot of the problems with the drainage systems is due to excess gritting materials going into the system when we maintain the highways. And so in effect, during the hot summer months when the thought of flooding is out of people's minds, when they're laying a road on a hot summer's day and, doing all of that stuff, they go away from it and they put a triangle on the road saying danger of skidding. You can all envisage it in your mind. Danger of skidding, loose chippings. And those loose chippings eventually find their way down the only place they can find their way to, which is down into the drainage system. And it doesn't present a problem. It's hardly noticed when that happens. And then come the winter time, the drains are blocked. So that's another thing that we need to look at to just help ourselves, simple things. So the question, Adrian, has it been reported to you or have you encountered in your previous roles? Chippings being a problem in there as well as leaves and stuff like that. And is there any evidence you can bring to us about moorland management and stepping up our efforts in that area? And finally, I know that Yorkshire Water are present. Can you talk to this group and tell us how you manage your pipeline system and try to preserve every drop of water as being precious? The problem always comes to the consumer. We have hosepipe bans and all that stuff when literally the water is flowing out of the system. Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks, Stephen. Adrian, do you just want to pick up some of the drainage points now, and perhaps we'll expand those? I mean, you might want to pick up some of what Councillor Patience said under that as well.
Yeah, of course I can. So you're right, Councillor Lee, there are, I guess, different issues in relation to the drainage kind of network and infrastructure. We do invest, several £100,000 every year in cleansing the gullies, and there is a schedule associated with that. I think there's lots of work to be done in relation to our asset management of the highway and what we want to see in terms of regular maintenance. But there is both regular maintenance of the gullies and reactive maintenance. But the report in this instance is highlighting that the majority of the issues were not due to siltation or blocking of the gullies themselves, but of the covers preventing water from getting into the system, and or land drainage infrastructure. And I think there's a few images in the report of trash screens that got blinded up, and again that caused flooding in the February 2022 event. I'll leave others to touch on perhaps some. I think we're going to have a discussion around the reservoirs later, so I'll perhaps one, allow Granville to speak to that, but to contribute at that time. And then I think apologies, I think I lost what your other question for me might have been, Councillor.
I can't remember specifically what it might have been, but it's always good to hear you talking, Adrian.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem to me, I'm sorry, Councillor Hobbs will in a moment, it does seem to me that perhaps that whole issue about drainage and management, both the council's drainage systems and the wider one, is something we perhaps want to have a sort of a specific report on in a future meeting to catch up. I think probably actually maybe longer than I thought, Adrian. I think under your predecessor, there was work done on sort of mapping sort of drainage and water assets that are not in council's ownership as well. And I notice that continues to be an issue with problems with those as well. And we perhaps need to revisit the question of how we address landowner responsibilities with those as well. But I think Scott raised some interesting points about technology. You know, I've seen situations with land where it's just obvious in the intense rains we're getting, the capacity of existing drains is simply not large enough. It's a matter of basic fluid dynamics. I know in a few places, such as the schemes on Bacup Road, and I think I've forgotten the name, but the road going up out of Hebden towards Peckett Well, there's sort of arrays of staggered grids and presumably larger culverts underneath, but that's quite an expensive piece of work. But that may be the kind of thing we need to start to think about in some places.
And I think that, you know, that is work that the partnership has carried out. And again, sorry, just picking up on a few of the points that Councillor Patient made and Councillor Scully. And I think we do need to perhaps refresh our collective narrative in Calderdale. I do believe we're at the cutting edge and the forefront of climate change, both in terms of flooding and water management. But I absolutely take on board what Councillor Patient is saying, that there is a danger that we lose perhaps the single biggest impact for us, which is around flooding. So there is work we've. One of the other issues we have with respect to that then is some of the industry standards around infrastructure and capacity. That whether that's highway drainage or surface water infrastructure, which in many cases simply doesn't reflect the kind of the weather and the incidents that we are dealing with, which is why we've done some of the work that you've just highlighted, why there's more work to be done to look at this. And part of the work that's being carried out from the resilient infrastructure is actually installing cameras in some of these key locations, so we can actually see real time what is happening at some of these key trash screens. Just picking up finally on the point Councillor Patient made around resources. On one hand, relative to some local authorities, we perhaps do have a larger flood team, but I would say in proportion to the scale of the challenge and the work that we're dealing with, I don't think it is comparable, even within West Yorkshire, when you look at the amount of work that the Calderdale flood team in particular and all our partners deal with. It is of a different scale to any other authority that I can think of. And again, no surprise for me coming in, I'm quite keen to look at the resources that we have, whether that is fit for purpose, whether we need to strengthen, or whether there's more things we can do to pull in resources, because we have a large capital programme. But a lot of the work that the team are doing is very focused, and you'll see in the latest report on responding to reports of incidents. So there's a question around the Section 19s as to whether the threshold for Section 19 is appropriate for Calderdale. I think it's something like it's either 2 or 5 properties flooded triggers a Section 19 report, which for the vast majority of local authorities in England is probably fine. For us, we'd have to question whether we want to do a Section 19 at that frequency. And then beneath that, there is, I think, 96 outstanding reports of the flood team need to investigate, and that is dominating the work that they do. And I think there's a conversation to be had about actually where we want them spending their time, and how we want to position ourselves as a council moving forwards.
Thanks, Adrian. Councillor Holdsworth, I'll come back to you next.
Thank you, Chair. I think Adrian's partially answered my question in responding to Councillor Lee's points. You said that the gully cleaners regularly maintain the drains, but as I understand it from what you said, the principal problem before a flood is that leaves block the entrance to the drains, and therefore the water can't go down there anyway. But as I understand it, we only have 3 gully cleaners in Calderdale, and I wanted to know how often throughout the year the drains were actually cleaned to allow water and stone chippings, etc., to be removed prior to the winter months.
So we've got 2 schedules, but as a general rule, the primary network gets cleaned either every 6 months or 12 months, and the secondary network gets cleaned once every 5 years.
I think that's sorry.
Every 5 years. I'm sorry, I'm obviously not a water management expert, but that seems quite a long time gap. Is that usual for most authorities, or areas like ours where clearly flooding is a real problem?
I think also that is informed by surveys to check on the level of siltation, and the frequency can be adjusted. If when a gully comes to be cleaned, it is, we're seeing excessive siltation levels, that would be a reason to look at that. But obviously, again, we need to prioritise the primary network, and perhaps, but where we think we could refine that is actually on the back of the Section 19s, looking at particularly sensitive locations to surface water flooding. So at the moment, the schedule is very much geared around the network, the primary network versus the secondary network. But I think a refinement might be to look at where we're seeing consistently issues around surface water. But what that's another piece of work to be done. What that looks like and how much that might cost us is obviously something that we'd need to bring back.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
I suppose the other thing I just add, having had various debates about this, yes, I mean, on top of that, obviously there's the people complaining about drains and them being on an ad hoc basis, which is not always particularly effective use of time, but it's that. I think when I checked, the 5-year thing does seem to be pretty much a sort of a national standard for kind of estate roads and so on. But whether that reflects really, some of the challenges in Calderdale, I think it comes back to that question of our exceptional problems and what we need to do about them. But I think that is something you need to look at. Well, I suppose the other thing I'd add to Adrian is, my understanding is that when we get a forecast of likely flooding, we tend to do some targeted work in the most vulnerable areas. What sort of 2020 suggests to us is that list of vulnerable areas is getting ever larger, which is making that more of a challenge as well.
And I think it was just the lead-in time, Councillor Swift. I think ahead of the 2022 event, there are operations that we can do in advance of forecasted weather, but I think a lot of the debris the report suggested fall in the hours preceding that, which just was beyond our ability to cleanse or clean.
Yeah. Stephen, you want to come back, and then Katie.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, it was just that those figures I found quite alarming, actually. And I accept the point that you just made, Tim, that, if 5 years is an average nationally, well, then we should recognise that Calderdale is nothing like the average nationally figures that exist. We've got very special, specific problems. And so if it's 5 years everywhere else, for a start, it should be half that sort of number because of our particular problems. So I found that alarming. And that just arose in my mind a question that what data and records do we keep after flooding incidents about the known blocked drains and waterways that have really been part of the problem in flooded areas? Because what I sense is when the floods go away, we're all so relieved that it's gone, and everybody's usually survived and done a wonderful job. That's the time to start the work on the known problem areas immediately. And I wonder if we're all so elated that the floods have gone that we kind of just miss an opportunity to do something really positive about it. Because whatever the schedule of main highways and lesser highways might be, the ones that need the most attention immediately are the ones that have just given us known problems. So I just wanted to throw that into the mix, Tim. I think, it's too easy to just relax because the water's gone until the next time we get flooded. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. I understand the point you're making, and I think in a sense avoiding that is part of the very reason why we have this flooded board and the ongoing process. And the purpose of the Section 19 report should be to learn the lessons, and then the actions and recommendations in those reports should feed into the future flood action plan. Because one of the difficulties with the Section 19 reports is they're so technical that actually, it's a bit like safeguarding reports. Hopefully by the time you actually produce the formal report, you've already learned the lessons because you're 2-3 years down the road. But it's really important that we do have that loop, that these things then build into future actions. Katie.
Thank you, Chair. Just on the surface water, obviously we're massively aware that it's really difficult to predict, and we're getting new areas, as people have mentioned, across Calderdale. And just to bring a point across that you may not have seen, that through the West Yorkshire FLIP, so the Flood Innovation Programme, they're going to be doing sensors across West Yorkshire for surface water flooding. It's part of their programme. I'm not entirely sure when it'll reach Calderdale and where they'll be, but just that early warning systems that we have already for river levels would then be done on surface water, which obviously is music to my ears because it's great communication and getting those messages out. But just, I think with that body of work, it will highlight some of the areas that we already know about in Calderdale anyway, but could then lead to helping how, what programme you can work with to get these drains sorted, and whether it'll just work out in terms of priorities around Calderdale, how they're managed, because we all know it's not as easy as just saying, okay, the whole network needs to be cleansed every however many years, or this part needs to be done. We know the whole lot needs to be done, but we know certain areas are far worse than others, and we could prevent flooded businesses and properties with some of this surface water flooding just by knowing about it very early. So Jane knows far more than me about this, but I will pass on to Jane. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Katie. Jane, bring you in, and then I'll go to colleagues from the Environment Agency, if that's okay.
Chair, I have to declare an interest because I act as the sports spokesperson for the Flooding Innovation Programme. And I'm delighted to say, as Katie could confirm, as Katie says, that we have actually been very actively bidding for money from a number of different sources. And the purpose of the programme, if I could just have a little bit of a pitch, is to basically look at new ways of responding to flooding events and surface water, to stop doing the things that we've always doing if there are actually more cost-effective and more innovative ways of doing things. So I have to declare an interest in that voluntary organisation, obviously with close links to universities in terms of looking at where we can get innovation into water management. Thank you.
Thanks, Jane. Paul or Joe, is there anything you want to add from an Environment Agency perspective? Joe, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I can come in. Yeah, just going back to Councillor Scullion's earlier point around the gauges. I don't have an update on the specifics around the Brighouse gauge. My understanding is that is now fixed, but as to why there was such a delay in getting that fixed, I don't know. So I will take that action away and come back to you as well. And again, touching on the Network Rail damages, I think Paul will pick it up in his report, but there is an awful lot of work going on between our economists and their economists to make sure that we are building in damages into our business cases across the programme. Paul's nodding, so I've got that right. So unless there's any other questions from any of the councillors.
No, thank you.
Thanks.
And Granville, Yorkshire Water Supply, as Adrian's pointed out, we do actually have an item on the agenda further on about the reservoirs specifically, but I know that probably wasn't the only impact and involvement that you had in this process as well.
Yeah, thanks, Councillor. I can't comment myself on the Section 19s, I'm afraid. That's not something that I've been directly involved with, but I did just want to come back to, I think, as you and Adrian have said, we've got an item on reservoirs later in terms of the agenda, but I did just want to kind of come back on some of Councillor Lee's points. I mean, he's absolutely right to highlight that reservoir management and water management is a complex issue, and I think we've heard that, you know, across other aspects of the water cycle already this morning. You know, and he's highlighted leakage, I think, as an issue, but, you know, the complexity of the issue goes kind of well beyond that. And I think we need to just, you know, keep reminding ourselves that, you know, reservoirs in themselves will not stop flooding. You know, in some catchments and in certain areas, they may help to provide a benefit. And that's hence the work that we've been doing very closely through the Partnership Board and with the Environment Agency, particularly at Hebden Bridge. But I think, you know, it's also important to reflect that last year, you know, really highlighted the risk that climate change is presenting to the other aspects of water management, and that's drought and our future water supply security. You know, the hosepipe ban that we had last year wasn't because of leakage, but it was because we had one of the driest summer in almost 30 years. It was the first hosepipe ban that we had in Yorkshire since 95, 96. And in some catchments, it was the driest summer period in over 130 years of record. And indeed, just the other side of the hills from Calderdale up in the Worth Valley around Keighley, you know, it was the driest summer in over 130 years. And I think that just really illustrates the importance of ensuring that we continue to balance the water resources aspects and the public water supply commitments that we have as a water company with the conversation around flood risk management. And I think, you know, leakage reduction is very high on our agenda as an industry nationally and as a company within Yorkshire. But I think it's also important to recognise that leakage reduction alone is not going to be sufficient for us to address the issues and the risks that we see going forward around public water supply associated with climate change in particular, but also ensuring that we aren't over abstracting and we're helping to protect the environment. So, you know, we remain very much committed to an ongoing programme of significant leakage reduction. And I think, you know, the councillor is right to challenge us on that front. But I think it's also important that leakage is placed within the broader context of public water supply security and what we all collectively need to do going forward. I'll kind of leave the broader reservoir conversation till later on the agenda, if that's all right, Councillor. I think the other point that Councillor Lee was asking, though, was about upland management. And I wondered whether it was just useful just to reflect. So from a Yorkshire Water perspective, we've done an awful lot over the past 15 years around upland management and moorland restoration on land that we own, including land around Calderdale. I guess the most significant aspect of that in recent years has been the partnership we work with National Trust and other partners up at Gorpley in terms of growing resilience, so over 100,000 trees planted up there, further NFM activity carried out there. And we're in the middle of working again very closely with National Trust and other partners on a much more ambitious programme across the Calder, Colne and Holme catchments and joint estates that we have across those catchments. Again, significant amounts of tree planting proposed in terms of clough woodland as a part of the White Rose Forest, Northern Forest agenda. And we've also just submitted a bid into the Combined Authority for around £1.7 million to fund natural flood management activity across those areas as well. And then if I just kind of take my Yorkshire Water hat off and put my NFM one on, I think also just to reassure the board that the upland management is very much on the agenda of the Natural Flood Management Operations Group that I chair, which reports into this board. And it might be useful just to highlight that actually government has just announced this week a further round of bidding under what's called the Nature for Climate Fund, where landowners within upland areas can bid into that for funding to design and deliver upland restoration activity, peatland restoration and so on. So I think, I'd encourage kind of using this public forum, if you like, landowners around Calderdale to take a look at that and consider applying for funding through that.
Thanks, Granville, and perhaps we'll pick up a bit more of those under the NFM item if need be on future reports. Joe, did you want to come back on something before I bring Robin in?
I did, yeah. Thanks, Councillor. Just 2 quick points from me. Is one, just recognising Adrian's initial comment around underreporting, and I think it is something that we need to look at, and I don't think it will just be unique to Calderdale. So I'll take an action to speak to our area incident team about, to understand a little bit more about what constitutes a flooded property before it's reported to national, and obviously work with Adrian and his team about how we can improve that. Specifically for Calderdale. And then secondly, just again to recognise the amount of data that the Environment Agency have supplied Adrian and his team with for the Section 19, and we are only one organisation doing that. There's many others that are feeding into that. So yeah, the amount of work, and as others have said, that the technical detail that goes into this, these reports are really quite something. So we'll certainly take suggestions and recommendations seriously from those reports and see what we need to do as an organisation as well.
Thanks, Joe. Robin?
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Going back to some of the early comments, it's been a useful discussion, good discussion. Councillor Scullion said it. I think rightly said that we may be not necessarily at the forefront in very recent times, given many other places. It'd be wonderful, wouldn't it, if we were less of a focus for these issues? But of course, we're not. We remain very high risk, and I think Councillor Patient began to answer my thoughts on that, which is that we should see this as kind of water management and water catchment management within a context of climate action and climate adaptation. And so it's one of the key elements to our climate action plan. And I know that it's interesting, I think a week today, the Chief Executive of the EA, Sir James Bevan, steps down. It's the end of his time. And I think he's been a key voice on this. It is about adaptation to risk, as has been alluded to. We are going to be living with these risks, and the range of risk will change. And we saw what happened on the Norfolk coast last week, and the range of risks of water on communities is going to only increase, unfortunately. So how we become resilient to this as we can and adapt to it as best we can is really key. The other thing I'd say is that I think Councillor Lee made an important point about the fact that we are having these conversations quite often, quite similar conversations, and in the spirit of that, I think the thing I'd say about this report and this discussion this discussion hasn't wholly aligned to the content of the report. Understandably, we've focused very heavily on the technical stuff and on infrastructure. But there are three strands that we should consider from this report, and that's one of them. So that's the first. And the second is our emergency planning response. So emergency planning, there's a lot of recommendations and content here about how we most effectively respond in an emergency to flood risk in the context, as I think, as Adrian said, that we are unusually better prepared because of our experience than most places, but we can't be complacent. There are still things we can do better. So infrastructure is the first, emergency planning is the second, and the third is communications, both communications with and in real time with our communities, from our communities. The WhatsApp issue, I think there's somewhere else that says WhatsApp should be recommended. So I do think every form of communication is good, and in a world where we live with communities responding in real time. So what I would propose to the board is that we would, in the local authority, lead this, that do it with partners, is to develop an action plan that we will develop. Because the risk of this is, because we're used to these reports, we just sort of have a good discussion, try to take a few actions and then move on. I think we need a dedicated action plan around those three themes, which will equally involve Adrian's world and Sheila's world, Ian's world, Ian Day's world, and Lucy's world. And we will also work with all our senior team, who at some point could be the out of hours senior lead to deal with these incidents. So we will do it with partners, but I just propose to Chair that we will do a piece of work and bring that back in the spring. Because I do think we need to actually formally decide what we're going to prioritise and what actions to take in this. In the context of some of the recommendations are a bit vague, I have to say. Some of them are very good. So I think we need to do a bit of work just to make this into a very tangible action plan to make a difference. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Yeah, I'm sure from the comments and discussions we would welcome that. So that will come back in appropriate future meeting, Robin. Okay, thank you. I think that's been a really valuable discussion. Obviously, it was likely to be the main item on the agenda, so spent a fair amount of time on it. So I'll move us on, if we may, then to item 6, which is the report on flood risk reduction and investment group. Is this is this Paul? Yeah,
it is. Thanks, Chair. Yeah, I will quickly run through. So I'm going to touch on briefly the highlights to start with. So good news at Brighouse that we now have 50 businesses better protected. And that's part of the or partial completion of some of the asset refurbishment work that's been ongoing in the town. And I'll touch a little bit more on Brighouse later on. The Hebden Bridge hub that you're hopefully aware that we're going to open up at some point in the near future. I think the report says it's going to be March. I think it's more likely to be April now. I think the initial plan is to have it Monday and Fridays between 10 and 2. Just a slight issue at the minute. I think the leasehold, sorry, the owner wants the Environment Agency to take on the risk of all the major repairs required to the building, which doesn't feel quite right. So I think our legal teams are going backwards and forwards with that. But hopefully in April we will have that, and we'll look at potentially changing or making it more of a frequent opening hours as well when construction does begin. Copley, we had the really positive first stakeholder meeting in Copley Village back in February now. Really positive. We had the right people in the room. I think it was the best stakeholder meeting I've ever been at, actually, in terms of positivity. And I think the options that we have put forward to them, they're the right options as well, which is great news. Errington, not quite as positive at the minute. The project team are now looking at alternative options for the scheme. Sort of had a bit of a revisit of the costs, and sadly they currently outweigh the benefits of the project. The number of properties actually benefiting from the preferred option has reduced following some recent modelling. So it's likely that this will mean an extension to the programme. So we're actually looking at alternative delivery mechanisms for the canal overflow projects, because that was part of the Errington Hillside project. But that's not to say that the Errington project is stopping. It's still progressing, but I think it's going to be a slightly revised project moving forward. And I think there's a site visit with some of the key stakeholders today taking place, in fact. Go back to a positive, Burnley Road Academy, the primary school in Mythenroyd. So the full business case has been submitted from the Environment Agency now to our assurance team. But the company who are going to undertake the work have started the work at risk. So they've been carrying out some drainage surveys. They've also produced some really good 3D imagery of the entire school, so we can actually look at the school virtually rather than having to go out on site all the time. So really good from a carbon perspective. And we've also seen the options that the company are proposing, and we can't find fault with it at the minute. It looks like a really good solution to the school to better protect them. And once we've agreed that, we'll go to the school head teacher and board of governors to get their hopeful agreement to it as well. And there's an ambition of starting to put some of these measures in place during the Easter holidays. Some of the products can be bought off the shelf, sort of little minor puddle pumps and other pumping equipment. So yeah, potentially starting in the next few weeks, and then with an aim for the majority of the works to be carried out during the summer holidays. One final highlight I want to touch on, and it's not in the report. You may have seen some comms about it, and if not, they'll be due out any minute, is around the Walsden flood siren. Unfortunately, it's going to have to be offline from Monday the 27th of March till the end of April. And the reason being is that we've got some essential works to raise the electrical equipment at the kiosk there. Because in previous flood events, it's been affected, so the siren has been unavailable. So we need to raise the electrical equipment within that kiosk so it's better protected in the future. However, the primary service, the flood warning service, still is available, so residents can still get their text alerts, emails, phone calls, etc. So moving on to the individual projects, Mythenroyd, I won't. Maybe next meeting I might not mention it at all, but we've got some erosion protection works to be carried out sort of after Easter. So this is behind the properties White Houses, so the terrace properties. We've got some scour works to undertake there. Should take around 4 weeks to complete. And we will send some comms out about this, certainly to the affected residents, but the wider community as well. It shouldn't have much, it should cause minimal disruption, particularly to traffic and the local community. And that pretty much will be it for Mythenroyd at last. But that bit of work doesn't affect the flood defences, it's merely for erosion protection. For Hebden Bridge, the fluvial designs, the designs are being reviewed over the coming months. I think there's a lot of drawings to be reviewed, so that's why it's going to take a number of months. The project team have been working on some what we call value engineering, and that's identified a number of efficiencies across the project, which will hopefully save some cost and save some programme time. Also, over the last few months, we've been undertaking some vegetation clearance along some of the existing walls, and the reason for that is so we can undertake inspections of these walls to see what sort of condition they are in, and it'll inform the design further. I believe the archaeological trial pits are complete at the Wavy Steps and around sort of the Packhorse Bridge, and again that will inform the design for this particular area. And the planning and full business case submission are going to be, or forecast to be, submitted later or towards the end of this year. With regard to the surface water design, we've completed the integrated catchment model, ICM model, and that shows positively that the scale of the proposed system can be reduced in places, particularly around the pumping station element, so that shouldn't have to be quite as large as it once was planned. So that could reduce the impact on the park. And again, these results of the model will inform the detailed design, and later this year we'll look to undertake some more ground investigation works. Moving on, Stubbing Home Road. We've recently carried out a number of different surveys, so along the canal towpath, along Stubbing Home Road, and also opened up the Mill Goit beneath Trinity Square. Again, all this work will inform the design of the final design of the project. We had some really positive news for the Lockkeeper's Cottage next to the canal, which is a listed structure, and we've got agreement with Canal and Rivers Trust with what we proposed, but more importantly, the homeowner are happy with. We've worked with them, and they're happy with what we're proposing for there as well. And then another piece of work that's going on behind the scenes for Stubbing Home Road is around the main section of wall. We call it Wall A, and that's the long length of wall alongside Stubbing Home Road. And the team are looking at different construction options to try and minimise the disruption, keep vehicular access open, and also try and reduce the programme, basically trying to make that bit of the work more efficient and as least disruptive as possible, although there will be disruption. And we're still hopeful of this work starting towards the end of the year, prior to that with planning submission and a community event. I won't touch on reservoirs because I think we'll be touching on that in the next item, or the next two items of the agenda. Park Road Elland. This is a project that Joe leads on. The scope for this one has been agreed with our consultants, Arup, to look at all sources of flood risk, and the plan over the next 6 months is to undertake a model review. I don't think we need to undertake any more modelling. I think we've done that one to death at Park Road, but we'll look at doing some ground investigation and community engagement to produce some viable options in that location. I touched on Copley at the start, so that's the next project on my list. So we've finally finished the ground investigation, so we've completed our last bit at the railway embankment, and again, this will inform the drainage solution at the cricket pitch, that confirm that is the correct option. I think initial findings are that it's right, that it is what we're proposing is the preferred option. At Copley, there's 3 main bits of work that we need to do to reduce flood risk, which is the drainage solution in the cricket field, restoring the existing embankment, or restoring the life of the existing embankment that surrounds the village. So the proposal is to sheet pile the existing embankment, and we're looking at trying to bring this piece of work forward as well in the programme and start this year. And then the other bit is to reduce the risk from the canal and road, Copley Lane, by installing street furniture to try and stop that water, or reduce the risk of that water entering properties and diverting it to the rugby car park and through a new culvert with a flap on it through the existing embankment. The next project is Shorewood Road. I envisage this one, I hope, fingers crossed, that this will be the next one on site being constructed this year. We have a full business case approved. We have a contractor who is in contract with us, which is AE Yates. We're awaiting on some costs from them for they've slightly revised our initial design. And I think I've got a meeting with them this afternoon about that, but hopefully starting the works later this spring. When it's got relatively short construction period of around 6 to 8 weeks, and we'll do once I have more confidence on when the project will start, we will do some localized engagement. I've already spoken to Katie about this one because I know she's got an active interest in it. But yeah, it's in between Todmorden and Hebden Bridge for those of you who don't know it, and it's going to be a small wall, really trying to better protect 17 properties in that location. Hebblebrook, we're finalising some detailed design with particular attention to the sewer diversion that we have to do. So the team have been working really hard between Yorkshire Water, BAM and Arup as our designers and delivery partner to try and rectify that, and I think they're getting quite close to the solution, and we're looking at a full business case submission this summer with construction beginning in autumn this year. And Walsden, so we touched on, Joe mentioned Walsden earlier about, and Councillor Scully mentioned around the the network rail line at Bridge 96 and the sort of the benefits around that. So a lot of work has been going on behind the scenes of trying to find a solution for Walsden. So we've got new baseline modelling. We've modelled various different options because there's no one solution to Walsden because of all the different inflows and infrastructure there. Unfortunately, what we found is with our preferred option, the cost of it still outweighs the benefit. So right now we don't have a viable scheme. However, we're working. The reason we don't is because that scheme, standard protection, was a 1 in 100 year event, which generally is pretty unachievable in the Calder Valley. So what we're going to do is we're going to try and find a justifiable solution, and we're going to look at different lower return periods, and that might mean we can take out some of the solutions. It might mean that lowers the cost. It will probably lower the benefits as well, but we need to look at those different return periods. But in addition to that, we don't feel like we've probably maximised the benefits from better protecting the railway line. We didn't have quite enough information, I don't think, from Network Rail, so we've had a follow-up meeting with them. And I think we were looking at benefits that were to the railway line that were just in Walsden, really. But actually, the term I think someone at Network Rail used when I spoke to them, it's like a bit of a spider's web of impacts. Once you have an impact at Walsden, it affects the whole rest of the network, and you have delays and then increased compensation payments. So, like I think Joe mentioned, we're working, or economists from Arup, our consultants, and economists from Network Rail are working close together now because we really think we've underestimated our benefits for the better protecting the railway line. So we need to maximise them so it makes it that we have a more affordable and justifiable project. Other things that we're looking at as well is there's a tunnelling option being proposed, and I think there's a meeting about that next Monday, and then also sort of looking at cheaper solution or more cost-effective solutions, shall we say, in property flood resilience measures. So there's a lot of things going on behind the scene to try and make a project at Walsden work. Then next one is Sorby Bridge. Our Arup have now started some baseline modelling. We got into contract with them. That's going to be sort of a 6-7 month exercise. We have to have a sound evidence base to deliver any project, and at this moment in time for Sorby we don't. So that's hence why we're doing this piece of work. We've got data from Yorkshire Water, I believe, as well, so we can integrate a fluvial model with a sewer model as well. And then once we've got that signed off, then we can start looking at options to try and reduce risk. And again, it's probably going to be a suite of options similar to Walsden, but no options off the table at the minute with Sorby. Brighouse, I've already talked that we have 50 businesses now better protected, which is great news. Planning is now due, I think it's due to be determined this month. And then also the full business case is due for submission in May this year, with works beginning in the park sort of later this autumn, which will have disruption to the park. But I believe Joe has been working on some engagement around that and talking to partners, and that element and the main bit of the work, that's going to be around a 2-year construction period. And then the last couple of projects, certainly not least, are Backwaterloo, which is in Todmorden. This is a scheme that's trying to look at the long-term solution to scour and erosion protection to the riverbed and channel sides in and around the terrace properties of Backwaterloo. A scope is being agreed with Arup to deliver an outline business case along with a relatively minor or small-ish modelling exercise, because we can utilise existing modelling from sort of the work we've been doing at Walsden and previous work done at Shade Chapel, which is immediately upstream of Backwaterloo. So this is a really important scheme for us, as are all the others. And then last, and certainly by no means least, is a project close to my heart, is Callis. It's Callis Bridge. Reinvigorating this project. We've instructed Arup to undertake a bit of a data review. We've provided them all with all the data that we have and partners have, Yorkshire Water and Calderdale Council. And hopefully in the next couple of weeks, I'll be receiving a report of how we move this forward, see if there are any data gaps, and start to produce a strategic outline case looking at all sources of flood risk rather than just the fluvial element, which is what the scheme was designed to do back in, I think, the early, was it 2003, I think it was constructed. So yeah, like I said, look at all sources of flood risk. Open to any questions.
Thanks very much, Paul. It's very comprehensive. Stephen? Sorry, Councillor Lee, you.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, Paul, may I thank you for that report. And just as being said earlier about the earlier reports, the standard today has been absolutely excellent. So well done to you and your team. I've got a couple of questions. And these two things I'm going to ask you about are being mentioned pretty much throughout the report. The first one I'll nominate is modelling is frequently being referred to. And I just want to check whether all of the modelling based data has been updated to take into account, as Councillor Patient said earlier, that we've got a climate emergency, we've got weather that's changing. Once in 100-year events, when they happen each of consecutive years in Calderdale, tells you that those numbers are useless for modelling in Calderdale. The game's changed. So the first question is, all this modelling being done with the very latest data and presumably very different expectations of event frequencies? And secondly, from the very first line, I think, right to the end, you've referred to scour protection. And I've not heard the terminology before, but I do know in previous meetings, in previous years, a number of people have been suggesting that our rivers need to be dredged and made deeper to, make them have a greater capacity. And generally, I think that wasn't met with a lot of support, from experts. But is scour protection some kind of dredging or cleaning up of the waterbed? So the two questions. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Stephen. Paul?
Yeah, thank you. I'll come back on those. Thanks, Councillor Lee. Right, I will try and explain modelling and I'm by no means an expert. Well, I'm certainly not. So if anyone else is more informed than me, please chip in. But in terms of your question around, is it based on the latest data? Yes, absolutely. So all our modelling, for example, Walsden, one of the most recent pieces of work and completed modelling work, that has been calibrated against the 2015 event, the 2020 event, I think even the 2022 event. So the real recent events. So it is, and it's based on, all the rain gauge data that we have. It's based on all the river level recordings that we have. It's based but all the hydrology that goes into it. So they are real experts that undertake this work, and they do look at all the past data. So hopefully that answers your question. We also look at all the various, we say return periods, 1 in 2, we talk about like the 1 in 100 year, but we also include allowances for climate change as well. So all the work involves sort of increases in flows and increases in rainfall data. So I think it's all covered. I don't know if that answers that question. Hopefully it does, but it covers all previous events. That helps. I think you're on mute.
Right, Stephen, you're on mute.
Sorry, Chair. Just coming back to that point, the problem with using all previous data is most of the previous data is old news. because things have changed so much. So if there's a weighting in the statistics that includes all data, well, these events, which were once in 100 years, will be included in the estimates. So my concern is, I know that we've recorded the flows that we've had and all that, but when we're modelling for the future, we need to change the basis of our assumptions and projections. And so I think you're saying that they're doing it, but funny things can happen, hence the question. Thanks. So they don't want to go too far back because that's old news now.
Well, I don't think they can go that far. I think a lot of our gauges only go back a certain number of years, and different gauges have different records. So, but that they will utilise all the data that we have and look at future scenarios as well. So I think modelling is a dark art. I think if you spoke to two modellers, they'd probably come up with different answers. But we've got to have that evidence to produce or to develop any project. So hence why we do spend quite a lot of time and unfortunately money investing in river modelling, hydraulic modelling and combined modelling as well, in terms of surface water and fluvial. If I touch on the scour, I think you said you hadn't heard that. Scour is another word for erosion, basically. In what was the question? It was around, what was the question? I wrote it down. I can't even read my own writing.
Is it the same as dredging?
No, dredging is a performed act and deliberately to remove material by machine, for want of a better term. Scour is a natural process. A river erodes its banks sort of on outside of a bend, it will erode. But unfortunately in backwater loo, and just going back to dredging, this isn't something that effectively reduces flood risk, particularly in the Calder Valley. I think we've investigated that in the past in quite a detailed report, and it doesn't increase a standard of protection by clearing out the river. It's costly. You have to do it regularly. It destroys the environment, and it can also increase risk downstream. It can pass forward flow. So it's not a suitable solution to reducing flood risk in the Calder Valley. However, it is in other sort of lower lying areas, the Somerset levels. It's been shown to reduce flood risk in flatter areas. But no, it's not the same. But this is something that we need to do at backwater loo, because previous work that's been carried out, I think it was taking out a weir and a sluice gate, has actually caused quite significant scour to the riverbed in this area, and it's causing real quite turbulent water, which is increasing the scour. So we've tried to rectify it in the past with what we call rock armour, so putting in large rock, but it keeps failing. So we need a long-term solution for that location.
Thank you, Chair, for that. Just one final comment, if I may. You've just referred to a situation where some action taken has resulted in scarring that hadn't been anticipated. Hence the question earlier about modelling. It's very important that the modelling is done and it's carefully thought through, because the consequences of actions like you've just described, clearly in that case, were not modelled properly. Thank you.
Yes, yeah, it's very complicated. Councillor Brundell.
Thank you, and I'll start by declaring an interest. I'm going to come in on Walsden. I live here in a house that has previously flooded, thankfully, before I moved here. I think one of my questions has been answered somewhat. I had a similar point to Councillor Lee on the modelling, particularly in regards to the works in Walsden not currently being justifiable. I think, unfortunately, it seems like we may be in a situation where if we had a large flood event and damage resulting from that, the works will become more justifiable. I don't think any of us are in a position where we want to sort of wait for that to happen for it to be cost effective. I want to come in on the final point of the Walsden Flood Alleviation Scheme paragraph about the natural flood management measures. I'm aware of a location, without being too specific, above the cricket club in Walsden, where a concrete trench has been dug behind some houses there. And that was done after sort of engagement with the landowner, who was hostile to any natural flood management behind those houses. So the result was that this concrete trench was dug, probably not going to be that effective in a large storm. But I was just wondering, sort of, when we say, initial engagement with a landowner, what sort of things are we talking there? What tools do we have to sort of persuade them that this is effective and beneficial for them? Would be good to know.
Thanks, Councillor. I think, are you referring to First Street?
Yes, I don't want to be too specific and identify anyone.
Okay,
but
my apologies. But
yeah.
I just wanted to make sure I was on the right, talking about the right location. Yeah, so I've met the residents there, along with Calderdale Council and the housing association that I think own those properties. You're right. I think there was some challenging landowner issues there. I think, though, the housing for that particular location, I'll come on to the NFM side of things. For that particular location, though, I think the housing association have come to the conclusion that one of the major problems there was around the drainage being unmaintained. I think it was completely blocked and hadn't been looked at by the previous company for a long time. And I think that contributed towards the severe problem that they experienced. I think it was only a handful of properties in that location, but I think they've been doing a lot of work to improve that situation there. In terms of the wider natural flood management for Walsden, so that's, no matter what we do in Walsden, we unfortunately have to do for want of a better, a hard engineered solution. It can't be just a natural flood management solution. However, it is something that we're looking at as part of the problem, or part of the solution, should I say. Walsden has a huge opportunity and huge catchment to look at natural flood management solutions in the area. The challenge we've got is that they're all privately owned land. It's all more, the majority is privately owned land. We're aware of one who has a very large portfolio of land holdings, and we've started some initial engagement with them. So we are looking at, in addition to the hard engineered solutions, that more natural solution as well. But that is a challenge, because you've got to get landowner agreements. The lifetime of these interventions aren't particularly long. Who's going to maintain them? It's a challenge, but it's something that we're actively looking at. So hopefully that helps.
Thank you. It does. It sounds promising, at least. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Reagan, Councillor Dickinson.
Thank you, Chair. Brighouse. My understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that the flood defence and mitigation measures at the upper end of the valley are still nonetheless designed to not push water downhill, as it were, to therefore pass the flooding problem further down. Yet the evidence seems to be, and the folk memory certainly in Brighouse amongst residents, is that flooding's got worse since the measures further up the valley, much required as they are, have been put in place. So with the flood defence proposals that are there for, sorry, I'm stuttering. The flood defence measures being proposed for Brighouse. What assumptions are being built in there? Is it that the mitigation upstream is one that does mean that it doesn't push the flood problem downhill, or is it to take account of the fact of the increased risk of flooding as a consequence?
Shall I start, Joe, or do you want to?
Well, I can answer it if you want, Paul. Yeah, thanks for your question. So legally, we cannot increase flood risk anywhere else through building flood schemes. If we do, we have to mitigate for it. So with regards to Mythernoids and other schemes that are being built upstream, there is no impact on the flooding in Brighouse. And actually, as part of the Brighouse scheme, you probably won't be surprised to hear that we get a lot of questions from councillors in Mirfield asking exactly the same question as well. So again, you know, it's not, we don't just think about Calderdale, we think about the catchment as a whole, and we look at, you know, the whole sort of Calder, River Calder. So that's in the quick answer is no, we won't be, no, Mythernoid hasn't increased flood risk in Brighouse.
Right, thank you.
Thanks. Robin?
Yeah, thank you, Chair, and just thanks to Paul and Joe for all of this work. It just reflects the breadth and scale of what we're trying to achieve. I guess my question, or my sort of plea really is, but we face this, and I say this as the Chief Executive, not as a elected member, with an overall view of the whole borough, is prioritisation and focus. And I don't think if someone just listening to this, any member of the public would know from our discussion the breadth of impact of the different schemes. And to be blunt, Hebden Bridge Flood Alleviation Scheme is a huge scheme. It's a complex scheme, and we haven't really discussed it much. And I think I would really welcome a more detailed discussion on that scheme at the next time we meet, because it's probably got a level of impact in terms of the number of homes we protect, almost most of all the other schemes combined. And I don't know if we're reflecting that. And I know how difficult these schemes can be, and we have the same challenges in the local authority. But actually, we've just had in the previous item discussed Storm Kira, and myself and Adrian were in a very challenging meeting as a result of that in February 2020, in terms of the impact of that in Hebden Bridge. And the residents quite rightly were challenging us about progress on that scheme. And that's now over 3 years ago. So I did feel a bit of despair when I saw the timescales, because I would have thought the design development would have been long done. And I would have hoped that the planning submission would have been ready well before now. And I know we've had a pandemic, and I know we've had huge challenges, but that is a massive scheme. And in terms of the quantum of impact, I do think we need to understand how we can help push that along, really, and any way we can help in the local authority on that. Thank you.
Thanks. Joe, is that what you wanted to come in on? Or?
Well, it was just to say that I spoke to Adrian yesterday and suggested that actually at the next partnership board, we did spend some time going through Hebden Bridge, because I absolutely appreciate what you're saying, Robin. You know, it is a complex scheme, it is technical. And I think one of the things that I need to speak to my area flood risk manager and through Councillor Scully, and we've had conversations about this at the RFCC, is that the Environment Agency are very keen to report on properties better protected, but these schemes are delivering so much more as well. So it's about protecting infrastructure, it's about environmental benefits, about protecting businesses and jobs, and it's how we actually get that narrative of, you know, placemaking rather than just building walls and protecting businesses and properties as well. So we've got some work to do there, I think, with our story.
Okay, thank you. So we will take you up on that and have a report on that next time. Final comment from Scott, and then I'll need to move us on.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I mean, just to very briefly echo sort of Robin's comments really about some of the scale of some of this work. I think we can often be guilty of just getting on with things and not really telling people about some of the work that we're doing. And I think that applies to some of the decarb work that we're doing as well. And some of that is probably going to be managed by interpretation and getting some things up there so people know some of the work that's happened. But it's also, I think, a broader question about strategically what Calderdale wants to do and let people know what's happening, especially as we move into 24, Vision 24, 50th anniversary of the borough. How do we kind of make that real? So, I mean, some of this will be through volunteer opportunities, and I know there's stuff coming up this weekend in terms of Erindon Hillside and NFM opportunities. And getting people doing some of that work, you know, echoing some of what Slow the Flow did, communities taking charge of their own resilience. But I do think I'd really welcome a wider deep dive into the Hebden Bridge scheme, because I know like Mythenroyd, which I think protected, was it 400 properties and businesses or something? I forget what the numbers were. It's going to be a significant scheme, perhaps less problematic in terms of the highway, but equally as visible in terms of doing that work in a very, very, visible place. And even more visible now, Happy Valley's been on, we're on the map, Gallows Pole is going to be on in May. So I think that microscope on the borough is going to exacerbate the issues of doing big capital programs. Sorry. So just to echo Robin's thoughts on making sure that we have a keen eye on that as the scheme develops.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Paul, for that report. So if people are okay, I'm just aware of the time, and I do want to give reasonable time to the reservoir items. So the intention really was on item 7 only to raise them if there are any questions this time, rather than assume they've been read. So I wonder if people mind if we bring item 8 forward and deal with that next, please. And I'm not entirely sure is this yourself, Granville, or EA colleagues who's leading off on this one?
So I've got I've invited some national colleagues who are now turning their cameras on. So Steve, Andy, and Liz, yes, who are leading on the reservoir project nationally. So I'm just going to hand over to those guys, if that's okay.
That's fine. Thank you and welcome, gentlemen and ladies. So who's starting?
Good morning. So this is a bit of a double act between myself and Andy Turner. So we've got half a dozen slides. So I suggest if it's all right with you, we'll step through those fairly briskly. I'll bring Andy in to correct me on things about water resources, where he's an expert, and then we can just take some questions and go from there. So if you'll allow me just to share the screen, give me a moment while I navigate Zoom. Here we go. So there we go. So hopefully you can see this. So this is a piece of work actually that we've been working on now for a couple of years, and it's going to conclude very soon. Actually, we'll be publishing the framework we've been working on by the end of March. So really in the next 10 days or so. So just to put that in context, so we're almost at the end of it. So what we're going to run through is what we've been doing from a national context to create a kind of consistent way of making a decision about how we use water supply reservoirs for flood risk management benefit. And I think this presents some unique challenges in that it actually covers sort of quite a wide range of the regulatory responsibilities of the Environment Agency. So both directorates, both water resources and the sort of flooding side. So I'll kick off. I'll bring Andy in a minute, but I'll just sort of step through what we've done. So this piece of work to create the framework really follows on from an internal review that was undertaken in 2021, where we looked at actually what were the barriers and constraints in actually taking forward these kinds of arrangements where we would use assets, water company assets, for multiple purposes. And quite honestly, it boiled down to 3 things. It boiled down to the fact we have a legal framework that doesn't necessarily stop it from happening, but doesn't necessarily facilitate it and make it easy. There were issues around funding and the economics, who pays for it for how long and how, and then real issues about the fact we manage water resources and flood risk quite differently. Water resources has to be more strategic, cross-catchment, multi-catchment in some respects. You may see changes, within water resource management planning cycles, quite significant ones, whereas flood risk tends to provide an in perpetuity almost solution. So we have some sort of, opposing views. We proposed a way forward following this study to both Environment Agency business boards, both flood risk and water resources. And this is what they agreed we should do. So they agreed we should establish a national approach, initiate a joint project across the business, one that learned from and helped support live issues, develop this nationally consistent operating framework, test that framework, work with our water company partners to ensure it was collectively acceptable, and something that also allowed for local decision making. But also we would look to work with DEFRA and Ofwat to see if there were changes that could be made to the institutional frameworks that support or restrict this. So those 3 things are what we've been working on. Andy, did you want to come on the water resource principles that we've applied?
Yes, thank you, Steve, and good morning, everybody. So on the water resources side, I think when we were looking at setting up this project, there were perhaps all too often discussions about the weighting of the importance of protecting local communities versus the importance of keeping the taps on. And what we wanted to do was to try and come up with an approach that was win-win and made sure that security of water supply was still resilient, at the same time as identifying how reservoirs could be used to support flood protection. So that was one of the sort of principles that we were working to, that we didn't want security of water supply to be compromised. And when you look at a scheme, obviously lowering and releasing water will reduce the yield of reservoirs if that happens. So in terms of the approach that we've developed, what we wanted to do is to look at a way of assessing the impact of reductions in yield. We have a part of the legislation requires water companies to produce water resources management plans, which look at current and future demands. We look at the existing and future supplies that company will have, and what that then identifies is the gap. It's headroom if it's positive, and it's a deficit if it's not. So what we want to do is to move the thinking into a strategic look at those, the reductions in yield, and to have a look at what it might mean on headroom that the water company has for providing supplies in the future. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a bit. So by moving it to a strategic approach, we find ourselves taking a step away from some of the detailed tactical discussions around whether or not drought permits could be used more frequently and such like. So I think there's three sort of scenarios that we might find ourselves in around consideration of the water resource management plan. Firstly, it could show that there's enough of a surplus for a long enough time to establish a scheme and enable it to be supported from a water resources perspective permanently. Secondly, it could be that there is a surplus now, but it's forecast to disappear in the future. For example, if demands grow. And then thirdly, it could be that there is a deficit. So in cases 2 and 3, where there is a deficit either now or in the future, what we want to do is to switch the thinking around to funding for investment in bringing additional resources online for the water company, or increasing the connectivity of existing resources, or increasing the company's effort on demand management or leakage control, for example, so that the reductions in yield are mitigated and that the balance is neutral or even positive. So that's the sort of approach from a water resources perspective. There's lots more detail, but I think if we move on, and then that will enable some questions and discussion at the end.
Lovely, thank you, Andy. And actually, from a flood risk perspective, there are also some principles that we applied, and they are really that there's a plethora of existing guidance about how to appraise costs and benefits. So we align entirely with that. And that actually we need to make timely and transparent evaluations such that we don't commit ourselves to trying to take forward complicated, expensive studies without some clear benefit, up front. And that's a sort of pre-feasibility stage that we built into the framework. And that also there are some high level factors that we have to understand and address, such as reservoir safety, and of course things like environmental constraints connected to releases that might be made. And every reservoir is different, the context in which they sit is different, the networks that surround them are different, so we have to account for all of those. And that actually we should be appraising this on a strategic catchment scale, and that actually it should be aligning with adaptive approaches, such that we're not tying ourselves into long-term in perpetuity agreements that would impact either the water company or indeed, UK PLC and the Environment Agency. And also that we must be really clear on the costs and the benefits, so that we are investing along the lines of what the Treasury requires us to do, however, recognising that there could be opportunities to access local levy and even private investment. So it's quite a complex mix, but all of that has to come together to make sure we're making the right decisions and can pay for it. So this is what we did very quickly. 3 phases. We sort of scoped out and shaped under phase 1. You can see there in green, an initial framework. We then in phase 2, which was predominantly last summer, we developed the framework. We went out to consultation. It was a targeted consultation, not a broad public one, with key organisations that would have an interest in it and all of the water companies. And then finally, this is where we are in phase 3. We're almost wrapping this up, ready to publish. We've completed the products. They will go on .gov website. They'll be accessible by anybody that wants to see them, wants to see the framework, with a number of supporting material. And we're also taking forward some sort of recommendations internally to explore with DEFRA and Ofwat. So that's what we've been doing, and that's kind of where we are. And for those that like a process diagram, I mean, please, you don't need to look at this in detail, but I will just quickly explain what it is. So we have a document that reflects existing decision making, both for water resources and for flood risk. This is just a visual representation of how the framework is written. The idea is that at the pre-feasibility stage, we make decisions about whether there are sufficient potential flood risk benefits, and that those benefits are not going to impact water resource planning negatively if we try to pursue them. That's the pre-feasibility stage, and that gives us a number of potential sites that we can explore in more detail. We know there are a substantial number of assets owned by water companies that could provide some flood attenuation. We're talking about 65 assets stroke collections of assets. So Granville's assets in Hebden, above the Hebden, would be considered as one within that group, one of the 65. And then we would need to undertake the relevant impact assessments and then come up with some sort of long-term arrangement. So the framework allows us to go through that kind of thinking. It isn't a process, I should add, because a lot of these things are already well developed, but actually don't necessarily have the relevant evidence or the information to support a long-term decision or enable perhaps long-term agreements to be written. So I don't want to talk any more about this because you can read it when it's published, and I can't really summarize it in more than a couple of minutes. So if I go to questions, and then we can move on. So I stop presenting and hand it back to the chair.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much. So questions, Councillor Lee.
Thank you, Chair. Steve and Andy, thank you for the presentation. I'm not sure whether you were in on the meeting earlier, but I did mention the problem about leaking pipes, which I view as very, very important aspect of the use of reservoirs for storage. Because if the water is being lost in the pipeline network, as we all know it is, and incidentally, we all know in massive, surprisingly huge amounts, then that makes all of the calculations and the diagrams that you've just seen, which are easy to understand, but the elephant in the room there is if it's all leaking out, then you need to keep a higher level of water in reservoirs to cover for the anticipated usage. So, I mean, it's just obvious that you do. So if you fix the pipes, then it would change that calculation. So my question to both of you is, are you looking at investments nationally by water companies on fixing all these pipes? I do know something about pipes, and I know that there's a massive amount of money will need to be spent. And whether that's the government or the water company's responsibility, I'm not sure how it gets worked out. But I do think, and that water companies have been criticised nationally for giving higher priority to other ways of spending the money than fixing the basics. So could you please assure us that you're taking into account these massive water losses that make all of the calculations so much more difficult? Thank you.
So if I could respond initially on that in general terms, and actually I'll invite Granville to comment on Yorkshire Water's specific local circumstances, because I don't know enough about that. But in general terms, the water resources management plan process that we require water companies to undertake every few years looks ahead at the future demands and the options to meet those demands. And part of the solution for meeting those demands in the future is, of course, leakage control. You're absolutely right. And within the forecasts, government has set the water companies some very ambitious targets. I think it's to halve leakage over, I can't remember the period, but 2030s perhaps. Others on the call can confirm the dates. But there's some very ambitious targets and some very significant investment that is planned through that process to keep on top of and reduce leakage. So those figures should already be included in the plans, and tighter targets for leakage control will be included within future plans. So your point is right, it's valid, but equally I think that in terms of the calculations, it is built into the local water companies' assessments.
Thank you. And sort of some of the legal levers with that would probably rest with Ofwat rather than yourselves, wouldn't they?
I think in terms of water resources management, the overall responsibility for securing proper use of water resources is with the Environment Agency.
All right.
But in terms of the money, the financial regulator side of things, that of course is Ofwat in terms of the levels of investment that the water companies make and the impact on water company bills. So it's a bit of both, really.
Okay, in terms of the framework you've set out, I mean, so it's very interesting. I can understand why you need that kind of sort of national approach, but I'd just like to understand a bit more kind of what the implications of that are for the position we're in Calderdale, really, because obviously we've had we've had some pilot schemes. We think there is some evidence that managing that in some occasions managing the reservoirs would contribute to flood risk management here. Clearly, when water's pouring over the reservoirs down the hillsides, it's not contributing that much to long-term supply needs. So I suppose it's understanding where we are and what the implications of this are for getting this scheme onto a more permanent basis, really.
So yes, that's right. This is it's a nationally consistent decision-making framework that we've developed that enables local teams to make decisions within the approach that we have set out. So it is for Joe and local colleagues to work with Granville and Yorkshire Water to look at what it means for you locally within the guidance that we've set. Now, it's a lot easier to start from scratch than to follow the guidance right the way through the flow chart that Steve has presented. and obviously for Hebden Bridge and the reservoirs upstream, there are discussions and agreements and temporary trials and things in place that have been available historically. So the transition is different because you're in a much better starting place than elsewhere. You've got the experience, you've got the trials, you've got the knowledge of what works and what might not. So I think that we are advising our local area team to work through the principles of the guidance and to make sure that where possible it is followed, but certainly take a strategic view in terms of where we might want to get to, and it might be that there's a particular path that needs to be followed in order to get there. But that's the local colleagues to work through with the water company.
Thanks, Andy. Adrian?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I think, and apologies if you're not Granville, I think Granville might be providing us with a bit of an update on where we've got to with the Hebden Bridge reservoirs shortly. But as Andy's just alluded to, clearly, we have collectively been working for the last 7 years to tackle this problem in Calderdale. I'm really pleased that a lot of the work that officers have done have fed into some of the national thinking again that's been described. And I'm also really grateful that we're now in a place where we're trying to find a way to solve some of these problems to make it a more permanent, if not necessarily permanent, but a more permanent or long-term arrangement. And that's in no small feat due to officers, senior officers and elected members all coming together to make it happen. The question I have is perhaps a little unfair because it's a big one, but the issues I think we're talking about are big. You touched on, you mentioned something about needed to be considered in on a catchment scale, but I would suggest actually the considerations are larger again than that, because certainly when you start looking at water resources, the implications are not just limited to a catchment, but are regional and national. And then I don't know when you did join the meeting, but we've already touched on responding to the climate emergency, talking about flood, but actually water management in its entirety. And I think reservoirs is probably where the two really do collide. And I think for me, it's an example of perhaps where climate change is moving faster than we are in terms of looking at policy guidance and existing infrastructure. And I just wondered what conversations perhaps were happening on the back of this work with DEFRA colleagues and others about looking at, because the framework you set out is about how we look at using reservoirs for flood risk purposes within, give or take, the existing sort of framework. But I just wondered what conversations might be happening to actually look at the full piece again, because we definitely have not just a sort of climate change, flood risk and water resource emergency kind of bearing down on us, and we probably need to consider this, in the round and possibly at a pace greater than we are at the moment.
Yeah, well, let me just partly respond, Adrian. I think you're right, and I did talk about catchment, but I also said wider than catchment as well, because of course Granville knows this well enough. He's got to manage his networks strategically across multiple catchments, and the problem is with it, moving water around it's carbon intensive, water's heavy, you've got to pump it about, it costs a lot to do it. So all of those kinds of things have to feature into just how or not an asset could be drawn down for a period of time, and what the implications are if we get a drought, because too well, up in Yorkshire there's been drought conditions last summer and we're probably still not out of them completely. So I think the worst case scenario is we enter into arrangements that have implications for the water company such that they have to withdraw a flood risk benefit that the community sees. That's actually as bad almost as as kind of not entering into an agreement at all. So I think it's really important that we find ways that work from both a water resource planning side and a flood risk opportunity side, because Andy and I have talked throughout this project about flood risk might say, what's the size of the prize? Water resources would say, what's the cost of the loss? And actually, you have to balance both sides of that. So, yeah, beyond the catchment, we got to make sure we don't cause implications for Yorkshire Water in providing water during dry periods to yourselves, and so on. So it is a balance. Clearly, there are integrated water management policy, thinking that needs to happen within government. And I know that DEFRA are continuing to look at that. So is the agency, but it's not an easy thing because the way water is regulated and managed. So I think we've certainly made some suggestions that there could be ways of improving the rules and the systems we follow, but I don't think they will be addressed quickly or quickly enough to sort of come up with rapid solutions for particular locations. In reality, I think that's the truth of it. I don't know, Andy. I mean, did you want to add to that?
Well, I think the additional point I would make is that if you look beyond a water company's distribution network, there is work going on to look at the sort of national resilience of water resources. And there's an organisation called RAPID, the Regulators Alliance for Progressing Infrastructure Development, which is looking at some strategic resource development and water transfers across the country. So sort of a national grid, if you like. So absolutely, we're talking about implications that are well beyond catchment and well beyond water company areas. So this approach that we've developed also features within the consideration of new assets that are being constructed, as well as the existing ones. And then the other point I was going to make was that both DEFRA flood risk and DEFRA water services have been involved in the development of the approach and well built into the method that the framework that we've come up with.
Yeah, and actually, just to say one last thing, actually, Granville has supported all the work we've done for the last 2.5 years, and broader colleagues from Yorkshire Water have been involved, as have all of the other water companies. They've been very close in sharing their views, their opinions, their concerns, in helping us come up with sort of ways of trying to address them all. So including engaging on legal issues. We've produced a legal Q&A as well, which we've shared with all the water companies. So we've really tried to turn over all the rocks on this issue, such that if we do find ourselves in a positive place of being able to enter into an agreement, it's one that can work for both sides for a period of time. And actually, that I think has got to be a very positive outcome.
Thank you. Okay, Granville, is there anything you want to add?
Yeah, no, I ought to come in there. I think, thank you, Chair. I think the specific request from myself was just to provide a bit of an update on where we are with the Hebden stuff that we've been working through with EA. So I suppose, coming back to the framework that Steve and Andy have just been talking us through, what you will see within that framework when you have a chance to look at it is that a very early step within the whole process is understanding whether or not reservoirs can provide a flood risk or a potential flood risk benefit if they're operated differently. And that kind of role, if you like, lies with the Environment Agency. And Hebden is, a clear example of where we do have some evidence that managing reservoirs differently could help to manage flood risk downstream. And I say help, it's not going to solve the flood problem, as we've talked about already this morning. It is potentially a part of the solution. And we had that evidence back in, I think I'm right in saying, in around about 2016-17, when booster funding was initially allocated to Calderdale following the Boxing Day 2015 floods. So following that process, we undertook at Yorkshire Water an assessment of the water resources risk that some of the drawdowns arising from the flood modelling might present to us very much locally. And that resulted in the several drawdowns that we've had over the past sort of 5, 6, 7 years now, with drawdowns through a number of those winters to help manage flood risk within Hebden and Mythenroyd in particular. Where we are now with that is, I think, again, we've done that drawdown in some of those years. We haven't done it in every year. In 2018, we didn't have a drawdown in place because the reservoirs remained well below 90% full right the way through the winter because of the drought we had that year. And again, we haven't had a formal drawdown in place through the winter that we're just leaving now. For similar reasons, we had an extreme drought last year, as I say, the worst in almost 30 years. And I think, those two things, particularly happening in quick succession, again, just really highlight the forward risk that we're having to manage here and the real importance of balancing these issues. So where we are currently in terms of the Environment Agency programme is that they have an understanding, and we've worked with them on this, as to what might what capital works might be required at the reservoirs to make operating them to alleviate flooding and to reduce flood risk downstream more easy to do. But we now also need to understand what our water resource options are locally, to Andy's point, to make sure that we are not seeing any reduction in the standard of service and water resources resilience and yield from reservoirs sort of more broadly across the region. And that's where we are currently, looking at what needs to go into our next water resource management plan to potentially look to offset that yield. But I think, as both Adrian and Andy have said, and Steve too, that this needs to also be placed in a much broader context than just Calderdale in terms of the regional and national water resource challenges that we're facing into. Which is, significantly greater to how it's previously been assessed because of the changing climate that we've talked about on multiple occasions this morning. So, at this point in time, we have a draft water resource management plan going forward, and we are now working through regulator comments and other stakeholder comments on that to look to finalise that hopefully later this year. To the leakage point again, and we talked about this earlier, Councillor Lee is absolutely right to place the challenge at our door, but it is only part of the solution, and it does need to be balanced across other solutions as well, reducing demand with customers and businesses, and also investing in new water resource supplies to help us maintain that resilience into the future. So we're at that point at this moment in time. So over the next few months, we will be looking at what options we may have to offset the yield within that area, but almost inevitably, as others have mentioned on the call, it will involve more pumping of water to reduce, to offset any loss of yield within Calderdale. And of course, that comes at an operational carbon, potentially carbon cost. So that's where we are currently, I suppose, with that process. I think whilst that process continues, we remain obviously open to discussions with the Environment Agency and the Calderdale Partnership Board over specific kind of shorter term drawdowns over winters as we hit those winters, recognising that to put additional water resources infrastructure in to offset yield is not something that's going to happen quickly.
Thanks, Granville. Scott?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I'm aware of the time, so I'll be very, very brief. I guess just to track something that you said there, Granville, that sort of works into everything about the potential carbon intensity of some of these interventions. I guess it'd just be good to understand going forward in the round about how holistic that's being done, because it's easy to drill down onto particular projects and understand how carbon intensive they are. But when you take it in the round and understanding what not doing them might do in terms of carbon intensity and cleanups and management and resource, etc., is an entirely different story. So yeah. I guess it'd just be good to be kept in the loop, and it's not for now, like I said, Granville, it's just an ongoing conversation, and I appreciate not everyone might be interested in such things, but I mean I would from a personal point of view. So yeah. Just throwing that out.
No, fair. It's an absolutely fair point, Scott, and more than happy to pick it up with you offline. And to be honest, I think there is a broader point there as well when we look at water resource management planning more nationally, that the consequences of some of the things that we may have to do to protect the water environment from over abstraction, not so much an acute issue within our region at the moment, but certainly in other parts of the country, could lead to delivery of quite large infrastructure projects and moving water across catchments. And my own, and this is my personal view, is that there's quite a lot more work to do in that space to really understand the right balance holistically between all of those things, looking at local catchments, but also the more national impacts.
Thank you. Stephen?
Thanks, Chair. Just a last word. I'm aware of the time. I think that the water companies are a very powerful group of companies, and their single voice is a very powerful one. But all I can say is I was talking in a different place about 25 years ago regarding losses from the pipeline network in Britain and the lack of maintenance of very old cast iron pipelines, which are still in existence and which are prone, extremely prone to damage and breakages. And I've not perceived that anything's been done about it. And all I can surmise is it's not been done because the cost of doing what's necessary is absolutely huge. And so I think that I would like to really believe that the water companies are looking at that, because I accept we don't stop flooding by one mechanism alone. But if this precious resource is being lost in vast quantities every day because the pipelines are broken, well, then people won't be so keen to cooperate with those pipe bans and the requests that are being made to save water, when the water companies themselves are losing most of it, far more than the people doing the back gardens. So, Chair, I'm sorry I've gone on about the leaks, but I do think it's important, and I think we need to get on as a nation, as water companies, with fixing this fundamental problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. I think the point's been made and heard. I'll move us on from this item, if I may, because we are past 12 and I suspect we are losing people such a niche. So thank you to Steve, Andy and Liz for joining us for that item. We will look for the detailed guidance as soon as it's published. Thank you. So if I could very briefly, so the highlight reports under 7 are, if there are any urgent questions on those, can people just indicate very quickly? I'm really sorry. Can I just ask Jane to take the chair from take an urgent call?
Yes, happy to do so. Jim was asking for people to indicate if they had any questions on the reports, the usual roundup reports from the different subgroups, working groups. Not actually seeing MD indicating. Nope. Okay, I think you got away with it, subgroup chairs. So that brings us on to item 9, which is in fact my item in terms of the Yorkshire Regional Flooding and Coastal Committee update. We did in fact have the meeting yesterday morning, the performance and I was going to say performance improvement. The P&I stands for something else. I really don't have anything new to report from that meeting. Some of the themes that we've covered in this meeting were very much the themes of that wider Yorkshire-wide meeting. But I'm happy if anything comes up from the large meeting, which is forthcoming in April, the last of the current series. I'd be very happy to email the committee with anything significant for Calderdale that comes from those. Public question time. I don't think we've had any indications of public questions notified in advance, and of course we're not in person, so I don't think there's anything further I need to do. Sophie, is there?
No, Chair, we didn't receive any questions, so that's the end of that item. Okay, thank you. And thank you everybody for their contributions. I think it was a particularly interesting and significant meeting for us, and I think there are a lot of actions that are coming from this meeting. Thank you for